Good morning, and hope you guys are doing great. I'm gonna do a little blazing with Blaise Pascal this morning. It is Saturday at 10 o'clock, and it's always great to do some reading of his stuff. I kind of always enjoy it, and hope you do too. I'm gonna read from a couple sections of the wager. This one says, "How great the distance is from knowing God to loving Him." So that's kind of a neat statement. How great is the distance? How great the distance is from knowing God to loving Him. So that's one statement I wanted to read. So, how great the distance is from knowing God to loving Him. Right? You can know someone, but then loving them, right? There's a difference to that. We know a lot of people, but do we love people, right? So, how great a distance it is from just knowing someone to actually loving them. And I like this statement too of Pascal. It says, "Man is not worthy of God, but he is not incapable of being made worthy of him." Hey, good morning, Bob. "It is unfitting for God to join himself to wretched man, but it is not unfitting for God to draw man from his wretched state." So, two cool little sentences there, right? Man is not worthy of God, but he is incapable of being made. He is not incapable of being made worthy of him. Both truths are happening at the same time, right? So I think Blaise is looking at, biblically speaking, the corruption of mankind, right? Man is not worthy of God, but he is not incapable, meaning there is a capability of mankind to be able to be made worthy to know God, to be made worthy of Him, right? To be in to get to know God or to know of God. So it is unfitting for God to join Himself to wretched man. Okay, that would be based on God's holiness, right? It is unfitting for God to join Himself to wretched man, but it is not unfitting for God, a holy God, to draw man from his wretched state. So both those things are happening too, right? So it would be unfitting for God. So what we would expect from God is that He would not join Himself to wretched mankind, but then it would also be true that God would draw man from his wretched state to Himself. So we see both of those things true, right? That if the Son of Man be lifted up, He draws all men unto Him. We see that in the book of John, chapter 3, which is kind of neat. And no one comes to the Father unless no one comes to the I think it's the Son unless the Father draws him. What is that? John chapter 8. So you kind of see that in this section too. It is unfitting for God to join Himself to wretched man, right? Corruption. God's holiness, man's corruption. But it is not unfitting for God to draw man from his wretched state. So because God is loving, then He moves into drawing mankind to Himself. But because God is holy and just, He does not join Himself to wretched man. So two things happening, right, in both of those sections. So very cool. So I wanted to skip over to another part of the wager that says it's kind of neat. It says the true religion teaches our duties and our incapacities, pride and lust, and the remedies against them, humility and mortification. So I'll read that again. The true religion teaches our duties and our incapacities. So not just things that we are supposed to do or we ought to do, but it also teaches us our incapacities. Now this is important, I think, for us who like the Bible, is because if we don't interpret the Bible properly, then we are going to fall into an error. So it says the true religion teaches our duties and our incapacities. So if you don't understand what the goal is, and then if you don't understand your incapacity to do it, then you're going to run into problems, either with a dogmatic pride, kind of in like, this is it, and I'm doing it, and blah blah blah, and why can't you get like me, and why can't you do things like me, or or you get so wrapped up in your incapacities, right? Where you're just like, man, I stink, and man, I'm a failure, and blah, 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 blah. You can either go both those ways. There's got to be a balance there, right, in life. And I think of that even just in everything kind of thing, right? There's a duty, there's a goal, there's things that you ought to do or things you ought to strive for, right? And then there's incapacities. You need to know your limit or areas that you're weak in, or not beat yourself up when you don't make it there. So he says pride and lust, and the remedies of these are humiliation or humility, learning to be humble. And I keep always going back to humble thyself in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up, right? That idea of humility, coming before God in humility. And when Jesus taught us to pray, it was there was confession that was a part of the prayer that Jesus told us to pray. So humility is built right into that prayer. Forgive us our sins. So when we come to God in that way, we're going, hey, I have mistakes. I have errors, right? And so the Christian religion, Christian faith says, hey, we have errors, we have duties, but we have an incapacity, right? We have issues of pride and lust. And the remedies against them, we fight against them with our humility to always bring our incapacities before God. If you don't do that, then you fall into pride, right? Mortification, if you don't deal with mortification, crucifying your flesh, passages that talk about put to death the things of the body, right? To mortify, meaning to push those pleasure things that want, those animalistic things that want to just come out, push those aside, right? Lustful desires, right? And it says that's the remedy for lust. And those are things that we work on. But we work on all the time because Jesus taught us to pray like this, right? So it's part of our life, daily life. And just think if you didn't have that, what if you didn't work on? What if there was no working on anything? Because there's nothing to work on. What if your philosophy was there is nothing to work on? And someone say, well, you're prideful. What do you mean prideful? Like pride is just an abstract thought. It's an abstract thing you just made up. There's nothing objective about pride. You're just calling it pride, but I call it getting my way. What's wrong with that? Does a lion get its way? Does a dog want to get its way? Does a cat want to get its way? Does a fish want to get its way? Does a bear want to get its way? So I'm just wanting to get my way. So hey, you're saying I'm being lustful? Like, what's wrong with my lust? Like, you call it lust, but why do you call it lust? There is no lust, right? So what if it was like that, right? What if you didn't have any straight, right? If you didn't have any straight, then you wouldn't have any crooked, right? The only way we know it's crooked is if something's straight. And so, that's why Pascal, I think, is saying the true religion teaches our duties, meaning there is an ought, there is the right thing to do. But it also balances it out with our inability. So that's an important part of it. It's not just what you ought to do and having, the thought of, hey, there is a ought, there is the objective, hey, that's right, that's the right thing to do, or this is what pride is, and this is what lust is, that kind of thing. Um, but it also teaches the incapacities, the inability, the weakness of human beings. Now, I just want to finish with this. He says, without that divine knowledge of God, what have men been able to do? And what he's talking about, divine knowledge, he's talking about the gospel, really. Without that divine knowledge, what have men been able to do except either exalt themselves through the inner feelings which they retain of their past greatness, pride, or debase themselves at the sight of their present weakness, lust? For not seeing the whole truth, they have not been able to reach a perfect virtue, some considering nature as uncorrupted, and the rest as hopeless. They have been unable to avoid either pride or sloth, right? You see those pendulum just swinging. Some people look at the world and they go, man, this is great. This is the best. Look how awesome it is. And other people look at it and go, what a mess, right? And it says we have been unable to avoid either pride or sloth, which are the two sources of all the vices, since they could only abandon themselves to their nature through cowardice or escape it through pride. So that's kind of a neat, right? That the two sources, pride and lust, of all the vices, since they could only abandon themselves, the only way we can get away of our own madness to their nature through cowardice, which is like lustful cowardice, right? Weakness, or escape it through pride. For if they recognized man's excellence, they were ignorant of his corruption, right? So if we thought of man being awesome, then we neglected the idea of our corruption, and thus they avoided sloth but lost themselves in pride. And if they recognized the weakness of man's nature, they were ignorant of his dignity, right? And thus they could readily avoid vanity, but at the cost of plunging into despair. So that when they took care of their pride, they fell into despair. When they took care of their despair, they fell into pride. That's how mankind is rolling. And it says, thence come the various schools of the Stoics and the Epicureans and the dogmatist and the Platonist, etc., right? The different philosophers. And then he says, only the Christian religion has been able to correct these two vices, not by driving out one to replace the other through the wisdom of the world, but by driving out both through the simplicity of the gospel. For it teaches to the just, whom it raises to the very point of participation in divinity itself, that in this sublime state they bear still the source of all corruption, which makes them throughout life subject to error, to misery, to death, to sin, and it cries out to the most impious that they are capable of receiving the grace of the Redeemer, thus making tremble those who it justifies and consoling those whom it condemns. So the gospel, he says, makes tremble those whom it justifies, and it consoles those who it condemns. So what Blaise is getting at is that the gospel has a perfect remedy for the swinging tides of mankind, to wrestle with its despair, its incapacities, and its pride, right? So it's dealing constantly with its lustful nature and its prideful nature. The gospel is what is the remedy for that. So next week I'm going to talk more about that remedy and how to explain it through the lens of Pascal here. And hopefully it will be awesome, because it's a cool section for sure. I totally dig it. So I hope you guys got something out of a little bit of the Pascal today. And you guys have a great Saturday, okay? Take care. Bye-bye.